There are a lot of zombie stories in the world. We've seen blood, we've seen collapse, we've seen humanity at its worst. But what happens when the world ends and instead of screaming, someone turns on a microphone? Tonight, we step inside a radio station broadcasting during the apocalypse, not to warn, not to panic, but to offer hope. Mercury, a broadcast of hope, is not just another zombie story. It's an unfolding daily transmission. Episodes that live for only 24 hours, you can either tune in or you miss it, just like Survival. Created by David Benedict and Diana Lancaster through the Atlanta Radio Theater Company, this is a living experiment and in an audio story form. Community, resilience, and the radical act of continuing to speak when the world has stopped listening. Because what does the world need when it's overrun by the dead? A reason to live. Tonight we talk about that reason. David, Diana, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Hi.
Okay. When did the idea first come to you? Not the format, not the structure, but the feeling of it. David.
So the launch date was in 2017, and by that point, I had probably been sitting on this idea for 2 years. Um, I had a friend, Sean, who very much disliked the zombie genre, and I wanted to create a show that my friend Sean could listen to because what he didn't like about zombies was everything you just described: the blood, the violence, the betrayal of people against one another. And I wanted to create something that he would be able to listen to and enjoy.
Why a radio station? Of all the surviving structures in the zombie apocalypse, why a microphone?
So part of it was the fact that I had been with Atlanta Radio Theater Company for about 20 years at that point, and so the idea of a radio station came very naturally to me. But the other thing is that in terms of production, a radio station is a much lower barrier to entry. If we had wanted to resurrect a television station, for example, that would have involved having to shoot video, which is much more time and work intensive, um, particularly when it comes to the editing. When I'm editing episodes of Mercury, which are about 5 to 7 minutes long, um, it takes seconds for me to go through and take out all the little flubs that all of us commit from time to time. On a video broadcast, that would have been much more time intensive, and we would not have been able to maintain a daily broadcast schedule.
Did either of you experience a moment in your life where a voice on the radio felt like survival?
I mean, I feel like there are always times when things you hear on the radio are exactly what you needed to hear in that moment, and you didn't think that that's what you were going to hear, and then there it is. So I don't know, but I think yeah, it happens from time to time.
The episode disappears after 24 hours. That's bold, kind of risky. Why?
Well, as you mentioned, we wanted to do an experiment, and we also wanted to try to make the experience as immersive as possible. So, for traditional Atlanta Radio Theater Company productions, we go all in on music and sound effects. We create a very deep, lush soundscape to try to bring our listeners into the story. And for Mercury, because we had decided to be inside the radio station, speaking directly to the audience, there's not usually a lot going on in that type of environment. And so, in order to make the story more immersive, I wanted to try to uh, make the listener feel like that they were a bigger part of the story, that they're not just passively listening, that they're living in my world. And since we are on a traditional terrestrial radio station, if you don't tune in for that day's broadcast, then you miss it. And the way we accomplish that in a podcast format is to have the episodes expire. And I decided that 24 hours was a reasonable enough time for people to get the episode downloaded, which many of our listeners do. They don't necessarily listen every day, but they get it downloaded onto their device and then they'll binge listen to it. Um, but we our stats do reflect the fact that some people don't listen every day, and that's fine, because we write the show so that they don't have to. We do have about 3 dozen episodes that are permanent. Some of them are for plot related reasons. Others are because the people who wrote those episodes wanted their message to be available all the time instead of just for the very narrow window. Um, but for the most part, what we're trying to do is help people get the feeling and the sense that they are listening to a radio station during the zombie apocalypse.
Does it change how you write when you know the audience cannot rewind history?
Um, yes, I find myself doing a lot more recapping than I would normally do. When you watch other series, whether they are a podcast series or television series, in many cases, the writers of those shows will fall back on a kind of shorthand because they know that the audience is familiar with the material, and that if they're not, they can go back and listen to older episodes to pick up what these references are. And so you'll have shows that use a lot of abbreviations, that will make passing reference to a previous event without necessarily going into all the detail. Whereas in my situation, since I'm aware of the fact that my audience cannot easily just go back and catch up on these things, um, I will put in that extra detail, and I will say things like, "Hey, 2 weeks ago we talked about XYZ," and summarize the episode from 2 weeks ago that we are now following up on. Also, when it comes to abbreviations, we have a group in our world called the Zombie Friends Association. The team routinely refers to them as the ZFA. But at the top of the broadcast, I always make sure to mention the full name of that organization before we start using the abbreviation so that people don't have to be like, "What are you talking about?"
Are you comfortable with people missing parts of the story?
I am. And part of it is because the original vision for Mercury was not necessarily to have a coherent, solidified plot line. The show is at its best, in my opinion, when it's about stories and feelings and emotions, and that each episode is encapsulated in and of itself. Over time, that has become impractical. There's only so many episodes you can write about that kind of subject matter. And so we have sort of had to introduce a broader plot arc than we had originally envisioned. And in those situations, again, we can recap the relevant information that listeners need to be able to understand what's going on in that episode. Um, and if they miss the entire plot arc that we're talking about at that particular time, then that's okay too. At the end of the day, the show is about people. It's about life. It's about the stories that we're all living every single day. And we don't know everything that's going on in even our closest friends' lives. And so for the audience to not necessarily know everything that's going on in my story is fine with me. Someone heard it, they got what they needed to out of it, and hopefully those other people will come back.
Diana, if society collapses, what do you think actually collapses first? Infrastructure or identity?
I don't think we ever really lose our identity until we actually lose our humanity. So infrastructure can collapse, but people will still hold on to who they are. And I mean, we there are so many parallels between this show, which is fiction, and real life. And I think we see that in society today as things are happening in our country that we didn't expect to happen. You actually do see people leaning into what their identities truly are and what they want their identities to be. So I honestly don't think that people are going to lose their identity as infrastructure collapses. In fact, quite the opposite. People become more who they truly are when everything collapses.
Yes. And since this is your show about your show, I'm not going to elaborate into that, but to just say yes, Either of you, you've been doing this for 8 years now. Has this changed anything about your identity or the way you go about preparedness in your daily life?
What do you think, David?
I mean, it has certainly changed me as a writer. Um, I don't know if it has affected my preparedness, um, but it has certainly prepared me as a writer because when you're doing a project as ambitious as this, there are certain times and instances where you can't allow yourself the luxury of what I'm going to refer to as writer's block. Um, we have a backlog of episodes that are already written, so it's not like if I don't write one today that it's the end of the world and the show ends. But at the same time, you don't want to get too far behind because then you start eating into your backlog. Um, and so, a very common mantra among writers is that you should write every day if you want to improve. And so
But
that
you
gives me,
quite literally write every day because you have to keep up with our format.
yeah.
So it's not even just the, oh, it's a good idea to write every day to be a writer. You literally write every day because that's what we have to do to make this show work.
And yes, and it has its pluses and minuses. On the one hand, I feel like that it has tremendously improved my writing. But on the other hand, it can be very stressful. Like if it's getting to be like 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon and I haven't gotten the episode written and still don't have an idea for it, then I start getting just a tiny bit panicky. Even if we're doing really well, like we are right now. Right now, I set a a benchmark of being 2 months ahead on the writing. I should be writing episodes that can air in 2 months. Um, and right now, we're only 2 episodes off that pace, which is fantastic. We have been as much as 20 episodes off that pace, and that is very nerve-wracking. But even with that smaller deficit, if I miss a day and don't get something written, it feels like the beginning of a slippery slope because once you miss one day, then maybe you miss two, and then maybe you miss three, and then suddenly your -2 has become -10.
The characters share survival skills and coping strategies. Which do you think is more important in an apocalypse? Technical survival or psychological survival?
Well, when we started this show, we thought we would do a whole lot of practical survival skills. But as the show has developed, we have moved further and further away from the practical survival skills and way more into the emotional community, the soul survival, because that's really what the show is about how you survive as people and still live a wonderful, amazing, incredible life despite the circumstances you're in, and maintaining that is everything. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're alive if you're not living.
Yes.
And also, I feel like that it depends, that there's a spectrum. In the early days of an apocalyptic event, I feel like that physical survival is paramount because there are a number of systems and pieces of infrastructure that we have grown very dependent on. And if those went away, we would need to replace them. And that would not necessarily be easy for a lot of people. So you got to keep your body together in order to keep your mind together. Now, in our show, we did kind of gloss over a lot of those practical survival techniques and just sort of took it for granted that people were getting this done. But now that we're 8 years in, the psychological and emotional aspect of the survival is far more important because we have replaced a lot of the infrastructure. Do our characters have ready access to electricity? No. Ready access to running water? No. Ready access to communication techniques such as telephones or the internet? No. But they have reasonable substitutes or have found a way to compensate for not having those things. And therefore, they are now much more focused on their emotional and psychological survival, which is a very interesting thing for me because back, I think, in the third year, I felt very strongly that our characters had it too good, that there was that it was too comfortable, and that it was becoming challenging to write about hope because in order to write about hope, there has to be a certain level of hardship and despair. You have to have the dark with the light, and otherwise, neither of them work. Um, and so, in that instance, what I did was I had a gigantic horde of zombies come through and destroy a lot of the infrastructure that they had rebuilt because I wanted to get back to zero. We're now 5 years past that event, and I'm not feeling any particular urge to hit the reset button again, um, because I feel like that our characters have adapted in a different way, and I also feel as though that my approach to how to tell that story has changed in such a way that I don't necessarily need them to feel this particularly harsh hardship.
In apocalyptic fiction, hope is often felt as naive. Why did you choose to make hope the central engine of your ship?
I don't think hope is naive. I think hope is bold. I think choosing to maintain hope and focus on hope is actually a very courageous way of approaching it.
And I agree with Diana, and I would like to add also that in an apocalyptic situation, you need a reason to want to keep living. You've gone through a terrible trauma. You are now faced with a hardship were not prepared for, um, and you need a reason to get back up in the morning. And that's what hope is the knowledge within yourself that even if tomorrow is not better than today, the day after might be, and that's why people keep going.
And in all reality, a complete loss of any hope whatsoever is, in fact, a fatal condition. If you have no hope at all, you're not going to keep going.
Atlanta Radio Theater Company has been around since 1984. Why, what does it mean to carry that legacy into something this experimental?
It's been interesting. Um, the rest of the company is on board with the project, but the vast majority of them are not contributing directly. If I ask somebody to come in and play a guest character, they'll do it, but we're not getting a lot of writing support from the rest of Atlanta Radio Theater Company because they are more focused on the type of product that we've been producing for the last 40 years, which, as I mentioned, is that much more deeply soundscaped uh, offering. Um, and I will not lie, there are a few people inside the organization who would sort of like for me to put my energy towards something else as the executive producer. They're anxious and they're eager for more of the more immersive product that we normally do. But a couple of things have happened over the years. The first is that whenever Diana was ready to wrap it up, I wasn't. And whenever I was ready to wrap it up, she wasn't. And we both sort of tacitly agreed that we weren't going to stop until we were both ready at the same time. Um, and the other thing is that I feel like that there are a lot of forces going on in the world right now that make a show like ours necessary. Um, we don't get a lot of listener feedback, but the listener feedback that we do get shows very much that the people who are listening regularly get a great deal of value out of the show. Once upon a time, and this was been a few years, but we got an email from a listener who wrote in to tell us that um, it was her brother, wasn't it, Diana?
Hmm. Yeah.
Yes, that her brother had recently passed, and she was listening to our show, and Diana had written that day's episode, and we frequently put in what could easily be considered little throwaway lines like, it'll get better. There is hope. Keep going. Simple phrases like that are not necessarily deeply profound, but fit within the framework of the show. And she had written in to tell us that that was exactly what she had needed to hear in that moment as she was grieving her brother, that that simple, no frills message of keep going, you've got this, was what she needed in that exact moment.
What does audio allow you to do that television could never do?
All kinds of things. So in my show, because of the rules we put in place about not having zombies in the actual booth, we don't really have a lot of need for fantastical special effects. But in some of our other plays, the audio is so much easier. These days, with modern computer graphics, you can probably do pretty much anything that we do. It would just cost a lot more. But I did the editing on a show called Nairobi Jack and the Lost Gold of the Atlanta Mangani that culminates with a giant sea serpent that is made of gold. It's not colored gold, it's made of gold, and a guy has to climb up it using axes. Again, a budget movie studio can pull this off, but independent producers would be hard pressed.
Kind of expensive. Well, but expensive. What is the wisdom your survivors are trying to preserve?
Um, that we're better together, that we are better off not just with each other in the generic sense, but that we thrive on a diversity of experiences, a diversity of backgrounds, and a diversity of opinions, and a diversity of everything. The one of the things that frustrates me about this show is, as Diana mentioned, I do the vast majority of the writing. I write pretty much every day. And at my age, I have experienced quite a bit, and I have gone out of my way to have as many different kinds of experiences as I possibly can. But I have not experienced everything, and there are certain perspectives that I, as a straight white man, will never have. I will never have Diana's perspective as a woman. We have one of our newer writers, Callie. Um, they're non-binary. I will never have that perspective. I will never know what they're going through. I will never know what they're experiencing. And so when they write an episode, it is incredibly valuable to me because they're bringing in a perspective, because they have written a character for themselves who is actually a trans man. And I'm not qualified to write that. I'm just not. But I still want that perspective on my show. And so for Callie to give us episodes that present the perspective and the challenges of a trans man, particularly in a post apocalyptic society, is extremely valuable to me.
What truth are they wrestling with that hasn't fully revealed itself?
Diana, you want to
I
try?
think our characters struggle a lot with the fact that the immediate area around where our characters are living is doing very well. Everyone, for the most part, is working together and holding each other up. But outside their immediate area, the world isn't like that. We often talk on the show that we don't know really what it's like further out. But every so often, stories will creep in that are like, you know what, it's not like this everywhere. And I think that's something that they wrestle with is like, hey, everyone's doing great. We're all working together and building back a better world than was destroyed. And then finding out that not no maybe right here, but the wider world isn't as good as it is right around the station and right around their immediate surroundings and their community.
And I also feel like that we, as the storytellers, are struggling with that a little bit as well because we don't have like a master plan outline. the show. We're writing it as we go, and there are there are truths that creep into the storyline that sometimes surprise me. I'll be writing an episode and I'll write a sentence and I'll be like, "Wait, is that really what I want to say?" And then I'll be like, "Yes, it is, but I didn't know that when I sat down here." Um, and as Diana said, around the station, things are pretty good. Once you get outside the broadcast range, it's not so great. And we're currently, like, this is a current storyline that I'm working on right now, struggling with just exactly how much influence are we having? How much of the cooperation we're experiencing is because of us? Or is it just because people needed a nudge in the right direction and then took it from there themselves?
Right. What are some common core things that you need to have to write an episode? I'm going to go with Diana first.
Um, Oftentimes, something will spark an idea in daily life or in something you're scrolling and you see an inspirational quote. There's usually some kind of writing prompt that will then sort of blossom into an episode. We have several different kinds of episodes that we do that we run. Some are more plot driven, and some really are just characters expressing thoughts and feelings. And so sometimes it'll something will come together out of a quote, or I mean things like, a lyric from a song that is inspirational, and you can just sort of like write an episode around it. Or we might be moving the plot forward, and oftentimes we will have to sit down and brainstorm of where is it that we are taking this plot line or that plot line, and what episodes do we need to write to further those plot lines.
Thank you for that.
So
Yes.
I was just a great example of that was the fact that many years ago we got an episode donated to us from an outside writer who had written an episode where he wanted the team to go to a different radio station to scavenge equipment. And there was a guest character who was on that show, on that episode. And it was a perfectly fine episode, but it needed like 20 introductory episodes to naturally bring this character into the fold in a way that felt not so abrupt. Which that kind of episode is extremely helpful because it feeds the writing process.
So sometimes I talk about life imitating art or art imitating life. And this question is for Diana. You have a very unique perspective of how this project has played a part in your real life. And we're talking about zombies here. I would like to have your perspective from your work perspective on your design or the design of how the zombies are infected.
So the story on that is that the character that I play, Dr. Rosalind Clark, was designed as sort of my alter ego. So when we launched the series, I was working in the coffee shop industry. I'd been doing that for a very long time, but my educational background is in marine biology, and so I created Dr. Rosalind Clark to be that the character of a different direction that maybe my life could have taken. And so I actually have this background in science. And so when we were building the world and the zombies in the show, I was like, you know what? We're not going to make it a virus. We're going to make it a parasite. My area is my area is marine invertebrates, and so I was like, all right, I'm going to make it a parasite. And so we built that into the world. So I have that, biology perspective that I bring into the show, and every so often I will write episodes where my character is talking about science and talking about her work, um, from a scientific perspective on the zombies. And then to address what you were saying about this art imitating life, imitating art, imitating life, my own professional life has sort of converged with the Dr. Rosalind Clark um, timeline, in that I am no longer in the coffee industry. I am now back in science. So while I am voicing this character who is a biology professor, I am now once again a biology professor. So we sort of come back around on that one.
Um, I love the idea that you talk with the audience, not to the audience. Hey,
Yes, that is a very strong goal of mine, and I very much value the listener feedback that we do get. There have been a number of times over the years when I would write something that a character either did or they felt a certain way about something, and one of my listeners would write in and be like, "Well, I don't agree with that at all. I think that Max, for example, is being too naive. I think that Dr. Clark is being a little too harsh. I think that Michelle is being, is expecting too much." And those prompts give me an opportunity to address those feelings. And so in that situation, I do feel very much like we are having a conversation between myself and the listener, because I take their feedback and am able to send it back to them, not really in real time because we have to have the backlog, but within a reasonable amount of time, that I can address concerns that they might have. In some cases, I'll do this in real time, like on social media, but I prefer to do it within the confines of the broadcast, because that way we can say, "Hey, somebody who lives nearby stopped by the station, and this is what they said, and this is how we feel about it."
I like the idea of dialogue as art form. Diane,
The dialogue on the show.
as
Um,
art.
so I what's interesting with the dialogue, actually, I think in the writing process, actually, is when the dialogue doesn't go in the direction that we think it will. And I think Dave and I have both experienced this in writing episodes, where you sit down and you had this nugget of an idea and you think you know where an episode is going, and then it doesn't go in that direction at all. And you get to the end of the episode and you're like, I didn't even say what I thought I was going to say, but I just wrote an entire episode that was this entire dialogue between the characters that wrote itself. And maybe tomorrow I'll sit down and write the dialogue I thought I was sitting down to write today. And that's been a very interesting journey to sort of experience in the writing process, as the characters have developed and taken on life throughout the course of the show.
Character pushback. Very often when we're writing, we will get to a point where we think we know the characters so well, but then we get pushback from them. How do you deal with the pushback, David?
So, if I find my character doing something unexpected, what I normally do is stop writing and step away from it for a few minutes while I think about why the character wants to do that, and to make sure that that character is still behaving within the confines of their morality, their personality, and their experiences. And there have been a couple of times where I have had to be like, no, they wouldn't really do that. And I had to go back and rewrite it. But in many cases, I don't. In many cases, I let the characters tell me where the story is going to go. And like Diana was just saying, a lot of times I'll be like, okay, here's what this episode is about. Most episodes are 800 to 1,000 words, roughly 2.5 pages. I'll get down to the bottom of the first page and be like, how did I get here? And then I would have to decide, like, do I want to stay here? Do I want to let this conversation continue, or do I want to try to correct course and get it back on track? One of the most challenging parts of this story is finding yourself midway through an episode and realizing that you don't fully understand why they're having this conversation on the air. Because, like we were just talking about, it's supposed to be a conversation between the characters and the audience. And now, here we have a situation where the characters might be having a conversation between themselves that would have been better off if they had been having it in private. Um, in most cases, I let it go. I let them have that conversation because I feel like that they're making good points. And I also feel like that there is something about that episode that needs to be conveyed to the audience, and there's not really another great way to do it. I have on a couple of occasions had the characters conveniently forget that they're on the air. Usually, if that's usually that takes place like in a moment of crisis, something unexpected has happened to distract them, and in the course of trying to deal with that, um, they have to remember that they're still on the air. I So the show is not all serious stuff. We do a number of humorous episodes as well, partially for the comedy relief, partially because you got to write about something, and partially just because I thought they were clever. But one time we had a situation where the characters were having some discussion. I don't even remember what it was, and one of them noticed that there was a roach in the recording booth, and so they dropped everything to try to catch it and put it outside. And while they did that, like once they left the booth to put this insect outside, there was like a couple of minutes of dead air. And then they came back and they were like, "Oh, sorry, listeners. We'll be back tomorrow."
It is really, really important for sound and different kinds of things to be notable within an audio drama. What do you do to make sure that the episodes clearly come off as they are in a radio broadcast studio?
So I do a number of things on the technical end. The first thing I do is I intentionally degrade the signal. So we are all recording on the same types of microphones, which are Shure SM58s. Um, and so they're decent microphones. They're not top of the line, but they're decent microphones. Um, but having that clear signal gives me flexibility to be able to degrade it in the way that I want to, as opposed to having to live with poor sound quality from some other source. So I degrade the sound quality so that it can sound like it's coming through the small speakers that I'm envisioning that my listeners are consuming the show on. Small transistor radios, possibly a crystal set, something of that nature. There's also a static track that runs in the background. Um, and in many cases, that's it. Mercury is what I refer to as minimalist audio drama. We're telling our story primarily with characters, dialogues, and emotions. Um, Occasionally, we'll have a sound effect. If someone gets up and leaves the room, we'll have a door open and close. If they're reading a letter, the paper might rustle. Um, Very occasionally, I'll have the sound of someone sitting down in the chair. Like if they come in the middle of the broadcast, I'll have the sound of them sitting in the chair. But in some cases, I don't. Um, I add sound to Mercury when I feel like it's going to enhance the experience. If I'm working on something else for the Atlanta Radio Theater Company, I also only add sound when I think it will improve the experience. But I'm much more likely to add more sound in those instances. Mercury, if I feel like if we had too much sound, it would be distracting. Now that said, my character has a bit of a hobby of collecting noisemakers. And so periodically we will have some random object that Max has found that he wants to bring on the air just because it makes a cool noise. So we've brought on a kazoo. a harmonica, this little thing that went on my bicycle when I was a kid where you could rev it like a motorcycle. I have what's called a screaming yo-yo, which is a yo-yo that makes this high-pitched noise when you drop it. Um, Diana and I ran a relay race, and I brought on the relay baton because it made a cool sound when you put your hand at the end of it because it was a hollow cylinder. Um, and I'm always on the lookout for more little things that Max can bring onto the show that make funny noises because I think that it adds to his character and also because it gives me an opportunity to show people what you can do with even minimalist sound.
Let's talk about your logo or the graphic that we have here. And I am interested in who made it and how you developed the different pieces that are within it.
So this was donated to us very generously by an artist named C.M. Dotson. And he contacted Atlanta Radio Theater before we launched Mercury. Diana and I were still working on the concept and we're not ready to let it go yet. Um, but when he contacted us and said that he wanted to donate some artwork to Atlanta Radio Theater, I said, well, this is my opportunity because I don't know a ton of graphic artists and I certainly don't know very many who are willing to donate their work and time. And so I told him about Mercury and said, the only element that I gave him was a hand holding a microphone with zombies reaching up after it. That was the only note that I gave him. And this is what he came up with, and it was brilliant, and I have loved it. I have loved it ever since. I added the title, the Mercury, a broadcast of hope text is something I put on there, but everything else was Mr. Dotson, and as Diana said, it's perfect. It encapsulates every single thing that my show is about.
It's very cool. I really like it a lot. I like the idea that it's black and white. I think sometimes things that are done within shadow and light are more effective than something that's brightly colored. Although you look at that and it's like kapow with the color.
The color.
Do you think that people would think of it differently if it were brightly colored?
I do. And I also feel like that creating a brightly colored logo for this show would be challenging to do in such a way that didn't make it come off a little clownish. Um, Obviously, when you're talking about subjects of death and grief and hope and a better tomorrow, there's plenty of room for shades of gray. But at the same time, you are dealing in black and white terms in a lot of cases. And so I think that the artwork conveys the fact that we are the light fighting against the darkness. And the gray areas come in the places where some days we don't do so well, or some days we do better than usual, in which case the image can become lighter or darker. But at the end of the day, you're still dealing with the struggle between these two contrasts.
Diana, timing is everything.
Yeah, it's been it's been a wild ride in the timing of this show. We launched just at the beginning of the Trump administration, and then we went through COVID. That was a very interesting time period to be trying to write about a fictional apocalypse as we were all going through an apocalypse.
Yes.
And now we're living in this world that we're living, and it just feels like it continues, our fictional world continues to be so relevant in the real world.
And in
Building,
some cases, I have to push back against making it a little too real. I don't mind references and inferences, but I don't really want to bring those elements directly into my world because then it becomes more commentary and less fiction. Diana and I had a
We draw
number
lots
of
of parallels. We draw a lot of parallels, and we use a lot of um, allegory and representation within the fictional world without directly commenting on the real world.
yeah, we had a number of discussions about whether we wanted to bring the coronavirus into the Mercury world, and we eventually agreed not to because we felt like that it was a little too on the nose, and we already had zombies. We could address the coronavirus situation with the tools we already had without having to necessarily uh, bring that in directly.
And we could directly address issues that that everyone was facing in the COVID pandemic using the zombies as a stand-in.
Building the airplane while you're flying it.
Exactly.
Both of you. What do you got to say about that?
It's been a wild ride.
It sure has, and you never know what you're going to get. I like to tell people when I'm describing the show that when it comes to writers, people talk about the difference between plotters and pantsers, where plotters will sit down and write out a detailed outline before they start writing the actual manuscript, and pantsers just sit down and start doing it. And I like to describe us as the ultimate pantsers because not only are we making it up as we go, but we have to live with everything that has come before because we're publishing it almost in real time. And so I keep meticulous notes about events that take place in the show and will routinely reference back to things that happened 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago. And rather than retconning them, I will instead offer, hey, we're this far removed from this event, and this is how we feel about it now. I wrote an episode a little over a year ago where Max found some relatively valuable object on a park bench, and he didn't want to reveal what it was because he wanted to get it back to the owner, and he needed that person to be able to identify it so that he would know that it was really theirs. And a year later to the day, I wrote another episode about that exact same object where Max had reconciled the fact that no one had come forward to claim it. He didn't know how it got there. He didn't know what its story was. He didn't know why someone had left it behind. And what he eventually decided was that this person had some form of medical condition where they were not necessarily going to live very much longer and had left this object out so that someone would be sure to find it and be able to continue to use it, and that therefore Max felt as though he had inherited this object. And we got a listener comment about how they loved this extremely long form storytelling of a year between these two episodes.
So now is the portion of rapid fire. I will say one question, each one will give an answer.
Okay.
Hopefully. AM or FM?
AM.
AM.
One item that you would grab if the world ended.
A painting that's on my wall that means a lot to me.
Pass. Sorry.
One sound that instantly feels like safety.
Coffee pouring into a cup.
Um, Music.
Is humanity worth saving?
Yes.
Yes.
If Mercury were real, would you tune in or broadcast?
Tune in.
Broadcast.
There's something deeply human about a voice in the dark. Before television, before streaming, before screens glowing in every room, there was radio. A signal traveling through the unseen space, a stranger becoming a companion. Mercury, a broadcast of hope, reminds us that survival is not only about food or shelter, it is about connection, it is about meaning, it is about someone saying, "You're not alone." Even when the world is unrecognizable. Maybe that's the real rebellion in any apocalypse. Not violence, not fear, but hope transmitted daily. And maybe that's what we need right now, long before the zombies ever arrive. David Benedict, Diana Lancaster, thank you for turning on the microphone. This is Jackie Chin. Stay alive and stay listening.